Hey guys, it's the MetalBlade 5, and welcome back to another MetalBlade theory. And this is called MetalBlade theory, and not like game theory or film theory. I don't have to cover just video games. This theory involves the Marvel movies. I am a big fan of the Marvel movies, and not just the MCU. There's of course X-Men, Spider-Man, etc. And one thing that appears in almost every Marvel movie, which people look out for, is cameos made by Stan Lee. I'm assuming you know who Stan Lee is, otherwise you've probably been living under a rock for like about 50 years. Now, the idea for this theory came from some information I randomly found out about on YouTube. People have been constantly theorizing who Stan Lee plays in his cameos, but Stan Lee himself confirmed in an interview that his character is called Cameo Man, who has a cameo superpower which lets him travel through time and space and change his identity in order to cameo in the movies. This made me come up with the idea that you could place Stan Lee's cameos into a timeline of what order they take place in, since he's playing the same character in all of the movies, even when he's given a name. Now, before we start, I do have a few things I want to point out. I'm strictly focusing on the movies for this video, since I haven't seen the shows like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Agent Carter, even though Stan Lee has cameos there. Also, the most recent Marvel movie at this point in time is Ant-Man, in case you're watching this in the future and you don't bother to look at the date. Finally, I'm not going to include the Deadpool cameo in this video because even though we know Stan Lee is going to appear as an announcer in a strip club, he could have more to his cameo than what we know so far since the movie isn't out yet. Also, since there isn't much to Stan Lee's cameos, I did have to make some assumptions to connect some cameos in this timeline, but hey, the Pixar theory does that and everyone believes it. So, starting off our timeline, the first cameo is Stan Lee's cameo in The Avengers. Why? Well, because he says,
Superheroes in New York, Cameo break.
This shows that Stan Lee doesn't believe in superheroes, while in later cameos he does. This is the disbelief section, as I like to call it, where Stan Lee slowly realizes that superheroes do exist. This leads to the next cameo, which is his Daredevil cameo, where a young Matt Murdock stops him from walking into the street and getting run over. Stan Lee's reaction shows that he's very confused as to how a blind kid knew a vehicle was coming. Also, this is before Daredevil's around, so there isn't a superhero yet for him to realize that there is a superhero. Then, the appearance of superpowers becomes even greater in his next cameo, which is his X-Men 3 cameo, where Jean uses her powers to cause various objects to float in the air, including water from a hose Stan Lee is using. This gives greater proof to the existence of superheroes, and like with Daredevil, this was before the X-Men were around, so there are no superheroes at this period. Then finally, Stan Lee realizes that superheroes do exist in his X-Men 1 cameo, where he sees a mutant on the beach. This proves to him that superheroes do exist, as you can see with the shocked expression on his face. For the next section of the timeline, Stan Lee, now knowing superheroes are real, decides to learn more about the superheroes in New York. The first of which being Captain America, with his Captain America the First Avenger cameo, where he's like an army veteran or something and says,
I thought he'd be taller.
The fact that Stan Lee says he thought Cap would have been taller shows that he does not know what Captain America looks like, which shows he lacks knowledge about him. But with him being in the 40s, he probably learns about Cap eventually and moves on to his next superhero, Thor. This leads to his Thor cameo, where he's a pickup truck driver trying to pull Mjolnir out of the ground, likely because he heard that only Thor could lift Mjolnir and he wanted to test it to make sure. Then Stan Lee learns that all these heroes he's been hearing about are having a party, so he decides to meet them firsthand in his Avengers Age of Ultron cameo, where he's at the party and gets wasted on some Asgardian alcohol. Now learning about these heroes, Stan Lee doesn't have much of a reason to use his power, so he decides to get a variety of jobs. This leads to his Hulk and Ant-Man cameos in either order you want, and maybe the Deadpool cameo if I was going to include it. This section of the timeline ends with his Captain America the Winter Soldier cameo, where he's a security guard at the Captain America Museum exhibit.
Man, I am so fired.
And then he likely does get fired. Since Stan Lee has had a bunch of failed careers at this point, he decides to have a more relaxing time, but also chooses somewhere vaster. Like space! The final frontier! This leads to his Guardians of the Galaxy cameo, where he's on Xandar flirting with the woman while Rocket watches him. Since Stan Lee now sees how much of a flirt he is, he decides to flirt with as many women as he can. This leads to his Iron Man cameo, where Tony Stark mistakes him for Hugh Hefner.
Look great, Hef.
This leads to one of Cameo Man's other powers, where he can change his identity to others. So here, everyone sees him as Hugh Hefner, and seeing as to how Stan Lee's reaction makes it look like he's kind of confused in this scene, he is likely only now learning that he has this power. With this newfound power, Stan Lee decides to try it out as much as possible, leading to his cameos where he's given a name. This includes his Iron Man 2 cameo where he's Larry King, his Iron Man 3 cameo where he's a judge since he would have to have some sort of importance to be a judge, and his Fantastic Four cameo where he's Willie Lumpkin, who's just the postman for the Fantastic Four. Again, these can be in any order you want. For the end of the section, we have his Fantastic Four Rise of the Silver Surfer cameo, where he tries to get into Reed Richards and Susan Storm's wedding by giving the name Stan Lee, but the guard doesn't believe him. Now, I know this is referencing something that happened in the comics where the same thing happened to Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, but in the case of Cameo Man, this could be a way of seeing his identity powers starting to fade as people are seeing through his tricks. As such, Stan Lee decides to go back to relaxing, this time in an alternate New York. This is where we come to the Spider-Man movie cameos. First off is Spider-Man 3, where Stan Lee is very calm and relaxed. Then we have Spider-Man 1 and 2 in either order, where Stan Lee is present during Green Goblin's and Dr. Octopus's first attacks, which puts him in danger, and where he saves a woman from falling debris in Spider-Man 2. This shows Stan Lee that it's not safe here, so he goes to another alternate version of New York in The Amazing Spider-Man, where he is unaware of the danger as he's wearing headphones as Spider-Man and the Lizard are fighting in the same room. Then we have The Amazing Spider-Man 2, where Stan Lee is at Peter's graduation ceremony, where he says,
I think I know that guy.
This, in the case of Cameo Man, is referencing how he met Peter Parker already in the Sam Raimi movies in Spider-Man 3. Then, with all these crazy stories about these cameos he's made, Stan Lee decides to tell people about them, but obviously people don't believe him and likely think he's mental. So this leads to his For the Dark World cameo, where he's in a mental hospital with Dr. Selvig, who takes his shoe. Then he uses his powers to escape the hospital and decides to get back to relaxing. This leads to his Incredible Hulk cameo, where Stan Lee drinks some juice that has Hulk's blood in it, which could either kill him or give him Hulk's powers. As such, this leads to Stan Lee's final cameo in the timeline, and it's probably the biggest cameo in contributing to me making this video in the first place. His Big Hero 6 cameo. While I have unfortunately not seen the movie, I do know about Stan Lee's cameo in the end credit scenes, which I have seen on YouTube. In this scene, Stan Lee is the father of one of the characters who's been gone for a long time, because he's been making all of these cameos. And the scene ends with Stan Lee saying they have a lot to talk about. So with Stan Lee drinking Hulk's blood and possibly becoming a threat, he decides to tell his son all about all of the crazy things he's been doing since he left. And that's my theory. I know I did make some assumptions in this, but you don't have too much to go off of with the cameos, so that's why. But as always, this is just a theory, not fact.